Yeah, I mean, do you have any questions? Let me just simply, Paul, we ask you about this in a way funny things, movies, song, animal, whatever. If you don't
Yeah.
want, we can skip that. But if you prepare, tell us, then we will ask the questions. So,
Yeah. I prepared a bit for
okay,
that.
good.
I asked my team if they could give me good ideas.
So I'm just going to open up my my script, so I can do the intro. So I'll start with a quick intro, then Goran will sort of give the set the scene, and then I'll do a very, very brief intro to you, say welcome, and then we can just start with the with Goran's first question about the context. All right?
Excellent.
Great. Welcome to OTT Talks, a series of conversations with think tankers, policymakers, and experts around the world. This episode is part of a series of discussions with European think tank leaders to reflect on the nature of their work in a rapidly changing continent. My name is Enrique Mendizabal. I am co-hosting this session with Goran Buldioski. Today, we have the honor of having Pol Morillas with us. But first, Goran, why don't you set the scene for our discussion today?
Thank you, Enrique. We're really pleased to continue with the series of conversations with the current and former directors of European think tanks. In the first four episodes, we had really the privilege to interview four really notable leaders of think tanks in Eastern Europe. And now in this second series, we are sort of casting our net a bit wider. And there we interview a number of leaders of think tanks in Western Europe. The insights from these guests representing think tanks with a national focus, but also aspiring to link the country regionally and, of course, more broadly to Europe, were very invaluable. And I would say, to our good and pleasant surprise, we got a very good and positive feedback encouraging us to do more and as well to look at a lot of lessons learned that the European think tanks have had in the past, but they have not been documenting to date. In these conversations, we discuss with the think tank leaders the context in which they operate and the way they navigate it through difficult political circumstances. We also discuss the development of their own organizations, the key strategic decisions to grow, shrink, or change focus, and as well the impact that work had on the leaders as individuals. Um, in this sphere. We conclude with a request for their invaluable advice, which we hope will benefit the current and future think tankers, which is the audience for this podcast. In this episode, we have a very curious and unusual think tank operating from a country, but also with a very specific take on foreign policy from a corner. But for introducing our guest, Enrique, I pass the floor back to you.
Thank you, Goran. Thank you for this introduction to the series. So let me welcome our guest, Pol Morillas. Paul is director of the Barcelona Centre for International Affairs, better known as CIDOB. Before joining CIDOB, he was head of the Euro-Mediterranean Policies Department at the European Institute of the Mediterranean, EMED. He's been coordinator of the Political and Security Committee at the Council of the European Union and advisor on external action at the European Parliament, providing counsel on the EU's external actions and foreign policy initiatives. He is therefore an excellent source for any reflection on the changing nature of Europe and its relationship with the rest of the world. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Hi, Paul. Great to have you here from sunny Barcelona. And connecting to sunny Barcelona, I think we should start with the context. And the context of CIDOB is pretty peculiar. It is, one of a country, Spain, but also of a region inside Spain that always has pertained to keep the relationships with the rest of the world active. And no surprise, there is a foreign policy think tank in Barcelona that you lead now. But as we know, describing the situation in Spain and Catalonia would require a separate podcast episode. So we try to make this a bit lively and short by posing you a simple question. If the context in which you operate was a movie or a film, which one would that be?
Well, unfortunately, as any European think tank, we seem to be living in a dystopian moment, and the dystopian moments are very well represented in Black Mirror, the TV series, whereby we see all sort of things happening that we wouldn't have imagined before, and that's actually what's surrounding our work as think tanks in Europe, but beyond. We see the deconstruction of our liberal pillars and the politics that surround us. We also see increasing trade wars and nationalist views on the economy, which is driving the world away from globalization. We see multiple world crises happening at the same time. We see the influence of techno-authoritarianism and in our political system. So all of that actually is more about this dystopian future that the Black Mirror presents every now and then than actually what we were accustomed to when it comes to studying global politics and particularly European and Western politics.
Mm. Let me just dig a bit deeper in that, since you worked on many fronts on the EU and the Spanish foreign policy, and you described the general situation. Is there anything specific that you will say, like, as a key describer of the current context, and in particular, current context as seen from where you are? You know, a regional capital, but a capital that has a very clear global profile, and also a capital that engages with the rest of the world. Is there anything that stands out specifically from the place where you sit?
Yeah, listen, for us, the study of international relations or global politics has always been about studying a multiple and diverse number of actors. So for us, the way we understand global politics from CIDOB is not only about the traditional actors, it's not only about the states, it's not only about the international organizations, it's also about civil society, private companies, media, NGOs, and also all sort of other actors, also including cities and regions that make our international landscape plural and much more diverse than what one would assume from the traditional thinking on international politics. And actually, this is very much in line with the history of CIDOB, because unlike other think tanks, CIDOB was founded as a civil society-born initiative. So the idea was to open up Barcelona to the rest of the world, but also for the rest of the world to know better about Barcelona and as an important place where also global politics were discussed, despite not being the capital of a state, right, which is the traditional places where think tanks are located. So for us, we want to make out of complexity and out of the importance of civil society in international politics a leitmotif or a guiding principle of the work we do. So that's why we focus a lot on, for instance, not only geopolitics, understood as big power rivalry, we also like to focus a lot on human security dimensions, for instance, or on issues that affect the daily life of citizens when confronted to international developments, international phenomena. And that's actually what's the agenda is putting forward. This sort of complex discussions on international politics, I think, are more needed than ever. And if we only look, for instance, at the importance of global powers to set the scene, we might be losing an important share of the current discussions on global politics.
And can I ask you a quick follow-up question? Is there anything particular about the context in Catalonia and in Barcelona, so the political space there, that has changed significantly in a way that may have affected CIDOB's mission or approach?
Yeah, so I mean, for us, our location is important, of course, because location determines the way you look at things. I mean, at the end, if geopolitics is back to the scene and to the core of the scene, is basically because it links geography with politics, right? So where you stay is very important. So for us, from Barcelona, the European Union, Europe as a whole, has always been a reference framework for the development of the city, of the region, of the country, in terms of the relations with the rest of the countries of Europe, but also the Mediterranean, of course. For us, even if now the discussion in Europe has been very much focused on Ukraine and its impact on the European security architecture, how to deal with Russia, and so on. Of course, for us, from Barcelona, but also from Spain in general, the south is always very important. And that comes from relations with our southern neighborhood partners, includes Morocco as our border, of course, but not only Morocco, also the rest of North Africa and the Middle East. And actually, Spain has been very vocal on the Middle East conflict, and particularly in Israel and Gaza. So this is also very, very important to our research. We like to call ourselves more than a foreign policy think tank, which we actually also do. We advise governments, we advise the European Union, we advise also the Barcelona City Council or the Catalan regional government. We advise all these bodies of government. So we do some sort of foreign policy advice. We'd like to call ourselves more of a global politics think tank. So that means that we look at the issues of the agenda that matter to citizens, but also to governments, private companies, as I said before, and make up for these more complex dynamics in international politics. And this very much responds to where we are located. Of course, Barcelona as a global city, despite not being a capital city, it still needs a lot of this international thinking.
Interesting. Can I again step back and think about the sort of context, but in this case, look at the context of think tanks. And I have to be honest, I've been sort of following the work of think tanks in Europe and in Spain, but I've always find it hard to grasp the think tank landscape in Spain. The better knowns are CIDOB, Elcano. They're both foreign policy think tanks. I mean, that makes sense because, you're speaking to an international audience as well. I now know of the fantastic work of Fundació Bofill, for instance, but that's really because I'm here in Barcelona. I remember working with Fride a long time ago before they closed. But it's been hard to kind of get a good sense of that landscape. Would you be able to kind of describe the think tank landscape in Spain to us?
Happy to do so. Of course, Spain is an important European country, but also an important global country, right? I mean, Spain has links with, as I said, the Mediterranean before, Middle East, North Africa, strong links. It has strong links with Latin America. And of course, it has strong links with Europe. And as a consequence, also with the United States due to the transatlantic relation, right? So Spain is a very global country, but it has traditionally lacked the tools, the instruments that most global countries, and particularly European big countries, have had in the think tank sector. So most of the time, this has been an underdeveloped area of knowledge in Spain. And of course, this is slightly changing, right? I mean, with Elcano, with CIDOB, with other more specific think tanks, Bofill would be one, which has a very strong focus on education. The European Institute of the Mediterranean, EMED, is also focused on Mediterranean issues in particular. So there are other think tanks, but the more global ones would be CIDOB and Elcano, as you rightly pointed out. And I think that Spain is coming to terms with the idea that if it wants to play an important role in European politics in particular, it needs to accompany that foreign policy objective with a strong line of thinking, with a strong line of strategic thinking that only think tanks can provide for. And that is why we are seeing, particularly with the current government, but it's not only a question of the current government, and I hope it would be for future governments as well, to put emphasis on the development of think tanks in Spain. The same way that if you go to France, if you go to Germany, if you go to Italy, you go to other big member states of the European Union, they all have more than one, more than two think tanks, because plurality is what helps make your strategic thinking even better. And countering ideas and in a healthy way, competing over those ideas is what makes overall the result or the product that we produce as think tanks way better, because they are contrasted ideas, they are discussed among ourselves with other think tanks, and then you get up and you realize that you have a better idea than the one you had originally thought about from your perspective, from your own think tank, from your own pool of researchers.
And this plurality that you're referring to, is this something that could we expect to find it also at the regional levels across Spain? So, dealing with domestic policy issues in Asturias, in País Vasco, in Andalusia, would you find that that level of plurality, that lack of think tanks existing in these spaces, or do you think that they're enough? Where are domestic policy think tanks located in Spain? Is it at the
I think there are very interesting think tanks with more of a thematic focus, for instance, in the Basque Country, or on development, on democracy, for instance, and state of democracy in the Basque Country, but also in Galicia, in other places of Spain. You see the emergence of these more or less robust think tanks, sometimes associated with universities, sometimes more of a private initiative. So it depends, it varies a lot, right? But this comes together with the understanding that you have of Spain. It's very important. If you understand Spain as a centralized country, then perhaps you will foster thinking only from the capital of that centralized country. That would be Madrid. But I think Spain is not a centralized country. Spain is a very diverse country. Spain has multiple regions that have historical specific backgrounds, but also different languages are spoken in Spain, coming from these different regions of Spain. So if you understand Spain to be a diverse country, you also need diverse thinking to be produced from the different regions of Spain. And this will build eventually a more diverse Spain in turn, right? So that is a bit of a self-reinforcing dynamic that I think it's good for the general benefit of what I personally believe Spain is about, right? It's more than its capital city. Is about all these regions and cities, other cities that make up this country that is precisely powerful because it is diverse. So I don't see in diversity a problem for the role that Spain can play in European or in global affairs. Rather, I see it as an advantage.
And sort of following up with that, and I'll sort of jump ahead of one of my questions, but this diversity, I mean, that makes sense. It reflects Spain's huge diversity. That's true. You're right. Like looking at Spain from outside, you miss the fact that there are many nations within it, and therefore many kind of national elites and interests and dynamics, right? So I'm guessing that also has to do or affects the funding and the source of funding for these sort of different spaces or policy spaces or think tanking communities, if you want. So can you tell us a little bit about that in respect to the funding that CIDOB receives? Are you funded therefore by Catalonian government or elites or foundations or the individuals?
Yeah. So I mean, generally speaking, for most think tanks, the healthy way to be financed is diversity, right? You don't want to depend on a single source of income, right? And because that will guarantee your independence, that will guarantee your long-term stability as well, the ability to focus on the agenda that you really believe is the most important and that you want to put forward. So diversity in general is good for everyone. But CIDOB is a great example of diversity, actually, because we receive funding from all the layers of government that exist in Spain, right? So we receive money from the Barcelona City Council, we receive money from the regional area of Barcelona, the metropolitan area of Barcelona. We also receive funding from the regional government, so from the Catalan government, and we also receive funding from the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So all layers of governments are represented not only in the sources of income, but also in our board, right? They are all present in our board. And in addition to that, we have funding from private companies, from specific research projects that we undertake. And overall, there's a huge balance, right, between both incomes, sources of income from the public sector, all of them, and from the private slash European funded projects that are the other important part of our funding. So in diversity, I think it's where the secret lies. And that's what we have always put forward as an objective. Other think tanks in Spain are more funded from the private sector rather than the public sector. We want to also include the private sector more and more in the work that we do at CIDOB. And actually, the context is ripe for that because private companies are increasingly interested in geopolitics and international dimensions, and we provide good knowledge for these companies, and we are trying to make closer links to the private companies, which sometimes, and I have to be honest with that, the funding that comes from private companies, a lot of the times, at least in Spain, has been linked to the way you can interact with the public system or with the high level representatives, politicians, also with the structures, the political structures of Spain. So there has been a lot of interaction between the private and the public on the basis of influence, right? And I think that now what we are witnessing is that in addition to influence, which will remain an important feature for private companies to be engaged in think tanks, also more knowledge-based funding is also necessary for them because their operations, and Spain has great and big companies at the global level, their operations are linked to what happens in China or with the trade war that we are seeing and the trade barriers that are increasingly being put forward when it comes to tariffs or other mechanisms. So I think that they're all very exposed to geopolitics, and that's why I think private companies also will benefit from our work.
Mm-hmm. Those are very good points. If I can just make a point, Goran. So those are very good points because it is true that we're hearing from many other think tanks that are beginning to look at the private sector. They realize that this moment, when geopolitics is clearly affecting them, is a very good moment to present themselves as being able to help them understand this rapidly changing environment and the implications for them, in a way that maybe consulting firms that just provide information, and facts and data are not able to necessarily do. But the other point you made about access or, connections between private, public interest, that's also something that think tanks historically have sold, right, to their backers, right? So to say we can host conversations between multiple stakeholders where you can meet those that you want to influence, right, in a space that is to some extent public, right? So it's a very good approach as well in terms of making yourselves relevant and useful to your polity.
I always put the same example on this. Traditionally, what think tanks have aimed for is connecting academia or knowledge with politics and policymakers, right? To better inform the decisions of policymakers. That is still a relevant feature and objective of think tanks, but it's not the only one. And it's very important to understand it's not the only one. For me, and that's what I've been putting forward as a guiding principle of CIDOB under my leadership, has been the connection between, of course, knowledge and academia, politics, but most importantly, with society. And when I say society, I don't mean only civil society. I also mean private companies who are part of this network of society and participate in society in an increasingly important manner, right? So for me, connecting politics and society with knowledge is clearly the three-way purpose of think tanks, and we need to go beyond the traditional purpose of academia and politics or academia and policy making, which is where think tanks come from.
Thanks. That's really inspiring. Also, in the sense, like often with these conversations, Paul, we talk about dwindling funding, about shrinking of the market and the space and whatnot. And what you just described actually not only gives hope, but it gives a very specific environment where there is an acknowledgement of the need. And I hope also, in addition to the acknowledgement of the need, there is also the funds that go with it, and then that actually many of those players are also ready to put additional funds because they see the need, and hopefully more in a it will be more of a long run rather than a short-term surge when now the needs are the perceived needs are the greatest. But coming back to CIDOB, we touched upon several times, and you've been there for almost 8 years. In this time, what do you think that your think tank has done well? And
Mhm.
now, in hindsight, what do you think that you have done differently?
Yeah. Well, I think that a lot of my initial years as director of CIDOB were devoted to putting the house in order. Let me put it this way. So for me, it was very important that I could explain in an elevator pitch, right? What CIDOB is about, right? So for me, it was very important to make clear to broader audiences, in addition to our ecosystem, we all know each other more or less, to broader audiences to say, okay, why is CIDOB specific compared to other think tanks? It's basically what I explained to you, right? I mean, we are a civil society born initiative. We aim to build complexity and the plural study of international affairs an objective of our work. And we do that through the following thematic lines and the following regional approaches, right? And we have basically five research lines that we thematically pursue, and we have three regions of interest, increasing with a fourth one, which is basically Asia, right? But what were our main research lines, thematically speaking? Geopolitics and security, of course, very important for every think tank, but also migrations, role of global cities, cities as actors in international politics, sustainable development, and democracy and technology, the impact that technology has on our democratic systems. These are the main lines that we work on. And regionally, we cross-cut that with Europe, Latin America, Mediterranean, and as I said, Asia as a growing area of interest. So with that, that's what we do. And that's what we can produce research for. Now we've expanded. We've added geoeconomics. We want to add Africa to the mix as well, and so on. So we're expanding right now because we see or people understand the usefulness of having CIDOB as a strong actor, a research actor. So for me, the very beginning of CIDOB was putting the house in order in thematically speaking, research-wise, but also we wanted to have very clear lines of publication. What does this publication differ from this other one? What does this publication add value to? Who is the target of this publication or the target of the other publication? So put also some order into our publications and also our communication systems. We have expanded a lot the way we produce research, not only in a written format, but also in other formats, right? That are very useful for videos, documentary films we've produced. We've produced all sort of, in addition to social media, the products that we do for social media, very important as well. But as I said, I mean, the idea was to first and foremost have all this clear structure in hand and be able to project that to the wider audience, the wider public. And I'm always very convinced by the fact that you need to give something in return to your funders, right? The funders want you to produce substantial research, but also research that is useful to them. And by being useful, I don't mean being a consultancy firm, right? And giving them the exact study that they want on very specific issues. No, perhaps they want narratives. Perhaps they want strategic ideas. Perhaps they want to nuance their original views through alternative views. That's what we think tanks need to do. And I'm always very much in contact with our institutional partners to make sure that we are useful to them and that we can provide value to them, because actually at the end of the day, they provide funding to us, right? So this is a bit of a two-way street. What I would have liked to focus more from the beginning, and I'm now only starting to focus, is something that we mentioned, which is the private sector. I think I would have liked to be a bit more ahead of the curve and see what was looming in front of us, what was coming, which was this increased interest by the private companies onto geopolitics and international affairs. I think now this is a reality, but this could have been worked along the lines of better interacting with private companies before. not just for asking them for money, but actually for making yourself as a useful actor to them and engaging into MOUs, engaging into good interaction with them and prepare for that, right? Because now what we are seeing is that there are increasing demands to us, but we haven't really made the structure enough robust for those sort of interactions. So that I would have liked to focus more since the beginning, and I'm now only starting to do it because time is of the essence and we need to do it. But we should have been a bit more ahead of the curve, as I mentioned.
Thank you. That's really, in a way, it's really impressive. We'll come back to that. I have a very specific question exactly because of the image of Barcelona. But you know, Barcelona, the previous government made really, came into glory even at the world stage about its very progressive take on technology and the regulating of technology and whatnot. And you know, speaking to a director of a think tank based in Barcelona, I'm really curious. What's the role of technology or artificial intelligence? You know, you mentioned, you know, you want to be ahead of the curve. With Kike, often you know, when we talk with think tankers, when we look at things, you know, will Chat GPT and DeepSeek today, you know, start making all the policy briefs that are needed and so on. Does that factor in? I'm really curious
Sure.
in the
No,
work
it's
that you do.
interesting. It's a very interesting question because we had these recurrent discussions with our team, with the researchers, but also with the comms team and with the admin staff and everyone involved into the increased use of technology in their daily work. And we are only now starting to integrate our IA tools to the work we produce. Listen, what I think technological advancements, and particularly AI, with the work of think tanks, where these technologies can be useful, is not in replacing the original reason for think tanks, right? So they will, for the time being, at least, we'll see in the future, but for the time being, they are unable to write an interesting policy brief because they lack something that is very important, which is the human experience by, for instance, having traveled to that country, having met that person, having had that interesting conversation, which you cannot find online, right? It's only in person that this happens. So every policy paper that we produce, every research piece that we produce also always has this human researcher experience grounded into that paper, right? It's part of the paper. This cannot be substituted by AI or other tools for the time being. What AI can do is help us, for instance, in transforming those papers into different outputs. Because, for instance, you can perfectly ask, okay, do me a PowerPoint presentation of that paper. Do me, please, a press release for that paper. Do me a social media post for this. Do this more short or more focused for our newsletter, more focused section on this, and develop the newsletter on the basis of this section, for instance. And for that is very useful because, of course, before now, you would have had people spending their time sort of re-cooking what was already cooked in a certain way through a policy brief that you had already published. Now you can actually use AI for that purpose. And this really expands the capacity of think tanks to communicate their research through different formats and through different outlets. Never original research, but yes, on the basis of the research you've produced, for different audiences, for different outlets, as I said, right? So I think that is a good use. And for instance, in recruitment processes, in admin processes, you can use AI with a degree of supervision that will always come last. Not first. AI can be useful first for the way you operate, but then you will always need some human checking to that because you eventually need that, right? You need to have an interview with a candidate, for instance, of a recruitment process that you're launching. Why do you need that interview? Because the interview will tell you if this person you imagine can interact in a nice way with the work atmosphere that you have in your think tank, right? If there will be personal connections able to be put forward thanks to this person or not that person joining your think tank. As I said, these human experiences are very difficult, at least for our world in our think tanks, which are, well, we are 30 something people, right? We are not 1,000 people, right? We're 30 something. So this human connection will remain very important for the time being.
I wonder what you think about, or if you've noticed this, but we've noticed it on think tanks, and I've talked to some think tanks as well already, that ChatGPT is becoming one of the most important drivers of traffic to their website, right? So as your users, right? So your researchers might not be using it, but the users of your advice sitting in government offices or in other think tanks maybe, or in the private sector, they're going online and they're saying, I'm going to ask ChatGPT what they have to say. So it's the robot reading your content rather than the your ultimate user. Have you noticed that in your stats or in the way you access?
I'm sure that is the case, because of course all our research is open access. So that means that ChatGPT or any other interface can use our research and provide that as a source of information to the stakeholder who demands for that information. So I'm sure this is clearly the case for us too. But again, my feeling is that the policymaker, if we're talking about the policymakers now, will greatly benefit from a closed door interactive session with the pool of researchers more than by reading what CIDOB has to say on Venezuela or any other country, right? Because of course, yes, ChatGPT can provide for that information, but again, the fact of knowing the country, the fact of having traveled there, having done dozens of interviews with local stakeholders, all that is present in the paper somehow, but of course, papers are reduced in scope, right? Exactly. So the rest, you can only get it from personal interaction. And I think that this is where we as think tanks need to make our case, right? We need to say, no, listen, you cannot rely only on AI or ChatGPT for getting the information, because you will miss the other part of the important information. That's where our service to policymakers or to other stakeholders is still relevant, and we need to capitalize on the second part of knowledge.
Let us move. We've already been talking about CIDOB, and so before I ask you more about that, why don't we take a break from the serious questions and we ask you to maybe try to describe CIDOB in a more light touch way. So we have two potential questions. So if it was a song, what would be CIDOB's song?
There were a lot of discussions internally on what song would better represent us. Some people said Rosalia, because Rosalia is a Barcelonian-born singer, and who can sing to the rest of the world and be known everywhere. So that would be an objective for us. But certainly, one song that represents us very well is "Times Are Changing" from Bob Dylan. Okay. Bob Dylan says, times are changing all the time, right? And when he wrote that song decades ago, times were already changing, right? And times are changing now, right? So this should give us some sort of relief, right? And say, fine. I mean, we are living extraordinary circumstances, but circumstances have always been extraordinary. The only thing we have to do is adapt to these changing times the best we can, right? And I think that's a good learning experience for us to say, okay, fine. Moments are very, very acute, and the challenges are very, very harsh, but this is the general trend for humanity. So let's work on that.
Does that mean that CIDOB is also ever changing, ever evolving?
We have to. We have to. I mean, think tanks have to be ever evolving, because the topic that was very interesting a few decades ago is no longer the core aspect of society, or at least that's where society is not looking at, right? So you need to adapt the way you think about the topics and project the knowledge that you produce on the topics, because you want to remain relevant. That's the big thing for think tanks. Relevance is the big thing, right? So, because otherwise you go into other parts of knowledge, which are very valuable as well, but do not have that relevance touch within the thing, within their daily work, or not in such a manner as think tanks do. I'm thinking about very good experts in universities, for instance, who interact on the same topic forever, and they get along with the same colleagues forever because that's their field of expertise, and they are not exposed to the relevance of that topic all the time. I think tanks, we're not like that. We are exposed to relevance, and we need to be able to adapt our knowledge. So we cannot remain in our tower for the big heads and big names thinking on the same topics all the time. We need to interact daily with our stakeholders.
And I mean, Dylan also refers to a generational shift, right? So it's not just about the ideas, but about who's in control, right? Mothers and fathers rather land, don't stand in the doorway, right? Your kids are going in, they want to have control right now. What about that? Is CIDOB adapting as well in terms of who is in the room, like who are the researchers? Do you see a change in the makeup of your staff over the last decade or so?
Clearly the case. I mean, we have a very young pool of researchers. That's the first thing. Diverse of backgrounds. So, for instance, some are political scientists, some are economists, some are lawyers. So they come from different areas of knowledge. But what I think we've always kept in CIDOB for many years. I mean, we're 50 years old, and I think this has been a recurrent feature of the history of CIDOB, is that we are a pool of researchers. We are a group of researchers. We are not individual researchers working on individual topics. What we aim to foster all the time is interaction among these diverse backgrounds and this diverse pool of researchers, right? So that knowledge that is produced benefits from different perspectives. And I think that this is an important feature of some think tanks, not all of them, but some think tanks that can produce, and I'm using a sentence that is not very well perceived, but please understand what I mean, group thinking, right? Group thinking, what I mean is coming from a group, from a series of people who think together. And I think that now group thinking is something that is, of course, is seen as in a negative fashion, but what I would say is precisely, if the group is diverse, if you have different interests and different backgrounds and different countries of origins and so on and so forth, the thinking that you will produce out of these group interactions, out of these discussions with your peers, will be more plural, more diverse, more complex, if you like, but better, more accurate to what you actually are working with.
Yeah, I think you're referring to the wisdom of crowds, right? Which is that idea. And before we go into the next sort of serious question, should I ask you about the animal? I think you guys also reflected on the animal that represents CIDOB.
Oh, yeah. Since we are old, some people said we are an elephant, but we don't want to call ourselves an elephant because it provides for very slow motion thinking and so on. So we're not an elephant. We are old and wise, but we are not an elephant. What I think we are is, or we try to be, is dolphins, right? We want to be agile. We want to be intelligent, and we want to do and promote group work, right? And this is what dolphins do, actually, and they are able to navigate on circumstances that need to be adaptive, that need to go from one place to the other very fast, and because the context or where they swim changes every time, right? And you can see them actually everywhere, the dolphins, right? They are able to swim all sort of waters. And that is what makes them also very very interesting. And that's what CIDOB as a think tank needs to do. Adapt and be relevant.
That's really interesting. Let me ask you now a question. You've referred to relevance many times. You know, the times are changing. You need to change with the times, stay ahead almost. And you've spoken about relevance a lot. And I think I've asked you this question before when we've met in person. And a question I've always had about CIDOB has to do with its location, right? Away from the capital city where, sort of a lot of the decisions around foreign policy for the whole of Spain are made. And, you are a think tank, global policy, right? But you deal with international affairs and foreign policy. And then you have Elcano, which is another well-known think tank and sits right next to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Spain. And I just wonder, how do you maintain your unique role and your unique relevance in this sort of relationship, right, between two important, well-known think tanks and a Ministry of Foreign Affairs that is much closer, physically and also in style, probably to Elcano.
Yeah, well, of course, this also depends from what the ministry understands in terms of the sources of knowledge, and particularly with this ministry and with the minister in particular, he's a strong advocate for plurality of thinking and from different origins of thinking. So he wants, and the team wants to have more than one think tank, right? It wants to have more visions to better inform their policies. So we go and travel very frequently to Madrid to provide for that advice, but also we make Director General, Secretaries of State, and other, the minister himself, but multiple layers of decision making in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs come to Barcelona very often because they get a different sense of the discussion if they are in Barcelona or if they are in Madrid. So I think that this combination is very nice. And actually, perhaps we could ask our colleagues from Elcano if they feel it this way. But I've discussed this many times with them, and I think we share the same vision on this. What they say is that when they come to Barcelona, it's sort of a fresh air coming into the room because we look at things through a different perspective. Whereas when we go to Madrid and meet with them, we see the importance of power, right? And where power lies and where the most interactions in terms of being in a capital city take place, right? So actually power and freshness, they're good combinations of the way we think together, right? And that's why we are very complementary, CIDOB and Elcano and CIDOB, and we benefit from this sort of dual interaction that we have because we provide them for something that they don't have on a daily basis, and they provide us with something we don't have on a daily basis, right? And I think that that's what makes the couple work perfectly. And we actually meet every year. The teams of both institutes meet every year and jointly discuss issues. And this is where you actually see in this retreat that we organize, where you see this complementarity of views.
Really interesting. Really interesting. Thank
That's
you.
excellent example. Thank you, Paul. We spoke quite a lot about CIDOB, about other think tanks, about the context in which you work, the decisions, challenges, successes. So we spoke a lot about the organization. We would like to turn a bit the limelight to you now as an individual and how all of that has impacted you. So in a way, what has been the best part of your work of leading a think tank, or what has been also the most difficult part of leading a think tank? How this role has influenced you as an individual, as a researcher, as a thinker?
Yeah, well, I was a researcher in CIDOB before becoming director, of course, and I led the European, the partner or the European line of research. That's my background, European politics, particularly EU foreign policy. So I was a researcher myself, and I got to know the institution from the other side, if you like, right? Which is not the management side, but the research side. And then when the position was opened for director, I applied for it because I had an idea about the potentiality of CIDOB. I thought that we could do many things, and we had a great team to do those things. And I had colleagues who were back in time colleagues, researchers, who had a lot of potential for making the next step possible for CIDOB's history. And I think that we've clearly achieved those objectives under my leadership. So the good part of it has been, listen, when I started, we were below so about 800,000 visits, so below 1 million visits to our website per year. Now we are above 4 million visits, right? So we've quadrupled, if you like, the visibility of the institution. But we are present in the media twice a day, right? In all formats, written or TV or radio. We're present twice a day on average. CIDOB is named, or a researcher from CIDOB is named in the media, right? So that means that our exposure has really expanded a lot. Also because the context, unfortunately, is not very stable and demands for that knowledge, right? So these bad times in the world also make us think tanks working on global affairs more relevant, right? And of course, but you need to capitalize on that. You need to make you relevant, right? It's not only that relevance comes to you also need to seek relevance, right? So I think that's the best part of my job. The number of institutional relations that you do as a director of a think tank is great. I mean, you interact with all sort of actors from different backgrounds, different places of origins. I'd like to travel a bit more than I do, actually, because the pandemic didn't help with that. But in any case, that's something that perhaps I've done less than my predecessors, going abroad. But I'm now doing more of that than I used to, and that's a good part of directing a think tank. Of course, the bad part is always that you have to keep an eye on the more administrative and budgetary constraints that you do. Because you may have plenty of good ideas, but at the end of the day, you need to go to your general manager and say, listen, is this possible? Is this not possible? How is this funding linked to specific activities instead of the ones we'd like to do? Is this procedure in line with what the different regulations ask us for? Is this all this dark side of the think tanking, which is basically you have resources that are not all the time, most of the time they are not free for you to use, but have very strict regulations and very strict dynamics. Of course, this is a back and forth discussion with my general manager, who needs to get to know my work as a director good, and and the team needs to do her work very well known as well, because it's a crucial feature of an organization as a think tank to have a good general manager, because it will put you limits on what you can do, but it will make you use your resources in a proper manner, so that you won't have problems in the future, right? So it's a crucial component. Part of my task at the very beginning was to find a good general manager. And that's what I managed to do. Find a great general manager who works perfectly. And that was until I had her, that was a difficult timing. And then another part that is difficult for think tank directors, of course, is human resources, as in any organization. I always say the same thing on human resources issues. So problems that you have, right, on specific demands or specific circumstances that are hard for multiple reasons, most of the times not work-related reasons, are the ones that you take home with you and that actually get you awake at night, and you keep thinking about them and make you feel more uncomfortable, because they are difficult circumstances sometimes. And of course, you need to take decisions, and decisions are never of the liking of everyone, and you need to compromise with those decisions, and that's the bad part of being the director of a think tank, I would say.
And on that note, I mean, that's what additional advice would you give future think tank leaders?
Well, the advice I would say, the most important advice is get to know your institution better than you know it. So you need to understand which sort of think tank you are directing, right? A director of a think tank is not someone you can replace with another director of another think tank very easily, because the culture of the organization the perspective of the studies that we produce is very different from one organization to another. So you need to know your organization very well to make the most out of it. Once you know it very well, I think you can actually use the tools at your disposal and find your niche. That's an important advice I would give to a director of a think tank. Know your organization to find where you can be more useful and to understand where you can be more useful. Try not to compete with the big think tanks out there most of the time because we don't have the same resources as they do, but because their perspective will be different to yours. What you need to find is your specific perspective, what you can actually do that others don't. And where you find that, then you need to put all the machinery in motion to make the most out of this specific perspective that you have. And that's why plurality of think tanks is very important. You do not need one think tank per country. You need more than one, because precisely this is what will make the ecosystem way better. And I think that that's what I sort of managed to do quite well. I understood where CIDOB was different, where it was relevant, and how I could use the tools and the resources that we have to make the best for that case. And I think this is what eventually will give you more visibility, more impact, more capacity to interact with others. And finally, but very important, work in a networked environment. You need to work along with other think tanks because if you want to excel by yourself only, you need to be very powerful to do that. Huh? And if you're not, better do a lot of networking and a lot of joint work with others.
Yeah, that's really insightful. We always say that it's very hard to sustain an island of excellence, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need other organizations in your community as well. This has been fantastic, Paul. Thank you very much.
No, it's been a pleasure, and the work you do from on think tanks on this, I think it's remarkable. I think it's very important that organizations like yours exist, not only because of the training that you do, the multiple activities and courses and everything that we've interacted with you, but because you raise the profile of think tanks and the visibility of think tanks to make the case for this specific sector. Needs to go beyond the usual suspects. It needs to expand its vision, and I think that the work you do from On Think Tank is commendable on that regard.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, we can only do it because of people like you who are in the trenches, fighting every day. You can listen to the other episodes in this series and other interviews with think tank leaders wherever you listen to your podcast or through our website on thinktanks.org. From me and Goran, thank you.